America.
All right, so we went from being the most economical, wonderful prison to being the bloodiest 47 acres in America in
the space of about 70 years.
70 years?
Yeah.
How the mighty have fallen. And
in 1989, capital punishment ends and former death row inmates are transferred to the new state prison at Potosi. In 1991, the name was changed from Missouri State Penitentiary to Jefferson City Correctional Center, or JCCC. That name becomes transferred to the new prison they build, and so Missouri State Penitentiary goes back to being Missouri State Penitentiary. And on September 15th, which was a Wednesday, 1,355 inmates were transferred to the new JCCC building east of town, and MSP served as the oldest penitentiary west of Mississippi for 168 years. And in that time, had quite a few famous inmates. Some of these people you'll know, some you won't. It's okay. I'm going to introduce you to a lot of them.
A lot of them?
Yes, like Kate Richards O'Hare. In 1919, Kate Richards began serving a federal sentence at the Missouri Penitentiary that would change her life and contribute to reforms in inmate labor practices. In July of 1918, O'Hare, chairman of the Socialist Labor Party, gave a speech in Bowman, North Dakota, after which she was indicted under the new Federal Espionage Act, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to prison. While incarcerated, O'Hare was forced to work...
What is espionage?
Spying.
Spying.
Basically, she's the one that we talked about, went and stood on the courthouse steps and said, hey, the draft shouldn't be legal. We shouldn't have to send our children to die overseas in a foreign war.
Yeah, right.
And because of that, she was arrested and sentenced to prison, where she was forced to work 50 hours a week.
But there is no escaping destiny, because there was a reason that happened.
In a clothing factory, and prohibited from communicating with her husband or her children. In 1920, President Woodrow Wilson commuted O'Hare's sentence, and she was released. Later, she received a full pardon from President Calvin Coolidge, but her life was forever changed by her experience at Missouri State Penitentiary. She abandoned socialist agitation and pursued prison reform efforts. In 1939, 20 years after she began serving her sentence at MSP, she was appointed by the California governor to the position of assistant director of the California Department of Penology. In other words, she sort of oversaw all the prisons in California. Her reform efforts had a major impact on California's penal policies, and many of those reforms were implemented throughout the country. Then there's Emma Goldman, who, like Richards, was considered something of an agitator.
You imagine some of the things that people do and say now, and these women were thrown in prison for just speaking their minds.
Well, it was frowned upon in the 1920s. I don't agree with it, but that's the truth.
If that was still a rule today, a lot more people would be in prison, especially males.
No, see, that's just it. Guys
could do whatever they wanted.
Men could say whatever.
Yeah.
It was women that were.
Yes.
But Emma Goldman was serving one of several imprisonments for charges ranging from inciting a riot to advocating the use of birth control to opposition to World War I. At the time, the government called Goldman
Are you saying that birth control started World War I?
No. I'm saying that advocating birth control was considered so bad that she was put in prison over it.
Right.
But the government called her the ablest and most dangerous anarchist in the country, and she was pursued through much of her life by Anthony Comstock, and J. Edgar Hoover, who are infamous for being kind of overbearing jerks.
Ran the FBI for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
She is credited with having had a tremendous influence on the founders of Planned Parenthood and the American Civil Liberties Union. Not surprisingly, while in prison, Goldman was known as an agitator, stirring rebellion among the women prisoners. Prison administrators were glad to see her leave when in 1919, after serving nearly 2 years, she was arraigned before a U.S. commissioner. When she testified that she did not have the money to pay her $10,000 fine, she was told she was free to go anyway. The two famous activists, Goldman and O'Hare, left their mark on the penitentiary, and their impact would continue to be felt across the country for the years following.
So let it be written, so let it be done.
Then there's James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray came from Ewing, Missouri, a small poverty-stricken farming community. Ray was basically what they used to call a ne'er-do-well. He fought, he gambled, he robbed, he stole, and he was considered the bad element of the town where he grew up. So he held up a Kroger in St. Louis.
I thought you were about to say Freddy Krueger.
No, a Kroger, which is a grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
In St. Louis, and he got arrested, got sent to Missouri State Penitentiary, where he basically kept trying to escape and kept getting caught until he was working in the bakery when
Guys can't do whatever they want. They can just say whatever they want.
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much.
Or could say whatever they want.
Right.
Well, yeah.
They can say a lot nowadays, but they can't really go to jail for a lot of it.
Anyway, so he reports his job in the prison bakery. He gets in a box that normally they have these bread loaves in. And so, of course, they load him onto the truck thinking he's bread. Well, he breaks out of the box, breaks out of the truck, gets away. A year later, he assassinates Martin Luther King.
Because not only was he bad dude, he was also obviously racist.
Not uncommon, unfortunately, for that time, and certainly not uncommon in poor communities. And poor whites had a tendency to blame all of their troubles on black people, and I don't know why. So, now, another famous person was Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd. He pled guilty for his first offense, $12,000 St. Louis payroll robbery. So that's what got him sent to Missouri State Penitentiary. Upon his release in 1929, he continued wreaking havoc across the Midwest, robbing banks and murdering in cold blood with a notorious band of outlaws. By 1933, he was wanted in several states and known to the police as the most dangerous man alive.
Well, at least he made a name for himself.
Yep.
Even if it did consider killing someone or something like that, I don't care.
Hey.
I don't want to make a name for myself like that.
Me neither, but
Yep. He was eventually hunted down for his many crimes, including several murders. And they found him on a farm, and he tried to run away, and they shot him dead on the spot. So then there's Harry Snodgrass, King of the Ivories. I like this story. I've never heard of him before now, but I've looked him up since. Every Monday night, local radio station WOS broadcast from the dome of the Capitol building, and the prison band, which at that time was known as the Peaceful Village Band, was frequently featured on the show. Well, Harry Snodgrass played the piano in this band.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like the featured attraction. So he became like, this program was so well listened to all over the U.S., Mexico, Canada. People loved him.
Mm-hmm.
And they were known nationwide, and Harry Snodgrass was the featured attraction of the band. Well, when the announcement was made over the air that Snodgrass was due to leave the prison next year, would leave a poor man, more than $2,000 was received for him at the radio station within a couple of weeks. People just sent money.
Wow.
So he wouldn't leave poor. And at Snodgrass's final performance as an inmate in 1925, his sentence was commuted by the governor, Sam Baker. A crowd estimated at more than 1,000 people attended. Following his release, Snodgrass traveled with a vaudeville act and made several records for the Brunswick record label. He was later granted a full pardon in 1926.
That's impressive.
Yep. Then there's John B. Firebug Johnson. This guy's kind of a jerk. In the 1880s, he kind of caught the public's attention. He was the
hot news story.
Yes, he was the hot news story. Well, he was a notorious inmate. He kept trying to escape, but the most famous thing he did was setting a fire, and it destroyed more than $500,000 worth of property, caused the deaths of several inmates. He was then convicted of arson, and they added 12 years to his sentence, which he was locked in what they called the dungeon, which today they call solitary, for many years. Now, after he was released, he wrote a book entitled Buried Alive for 18 Years in the Missouri Penitentiary. But in that book, he stated he had been kept in the dungeon throughout that time. But that's impossible, because if they kept him there and not let him out, he'd be blind.
Probably, yeah.
Unless he slept the whole time. Would he still be blind?
What?
If he slept the whole time, would he still be blind?
I don't know, but how are you going to sleep for 12 years without being in a coma?
Exactly.
Then in 1950, Charles Liston arrived at the Missouri State Penitentiary. He was serving time for 2 charges of robbery with a deadly weapon and a charge of larceny. He was illiterate. He was one of 17 children. He'd rarely held a job. He was what they called a ne'er-do-well. But while he was in the prison, they taught him how to box. And he was pretty good at it. And he was so good that when he got out, he got into professional boxing and eventually became world champion. And he actually wound up giving back because he wound up running like a YMCA facility to try to help young men who had been in his kind of position. Poor men who didn't have much education, tried to help him come up and teach him the right way. So
absolutely, keep him from repeating his mistakes.
Right. And then another famous person that was in MSP, and probably the last one, was a guy named Robert, also known as Bob Burdella, who was a serial killer who had 6 victims that we know of. And he was housed... I'm not going to get into him because, 1, we're PG-13, and 2, you don't need to glorify what he did.
Yeah. You just need to say like a sentence or 2, and you're just like already good.
And he died of a heart attack there in prison, but he's certainly one of the.
Good for him.
Yeah. So those are some of the famous people. Now, before we get into the centennial cells and everything else, let's take a few moments for a word from our sponsors. Cool.
All right. I think we're sponsored.
Yes. So, one of the other things I wanted to cover is the centennial cells. Basically, at some point, they were told that they couldn't keep the death row inmates cooped up. They had to give them access to the outside. But they didn't want them, like, free on the yard or anything where they could maybe get someone to help them break out or something, or maybe kill them before the state could do it, because the state's pretty serious about that. So they kept them in these basically cages outside where they could run a little bit, do some exercise, get fresh air. And then there was a problem, and they had to work on this area. So they were digging down, and they hit something solid. Well, that solid turned out to be the